I've made lots of videos about predictors of divorce on this channel, mainly looking at the research of John Gottman. But there's one predictor of divorce that I don't think Gottman or really any of us talk about enough. And that is how your parents divorcing is a risk factor for you yourself divorcing. I took a look at the research and today I'm going to break it all down for you, including concrete tips you can take for how to offset this risk factor in your life if you're a divorcing parent or if you're an adult child of divorced parents. There was one TikTok video in particular that got me thinking about this topic, but let me show it to you.
Fear for our relationship.
That we would get divorced. Yeah. Divorce runs in our family. Like, my family got divorced. Her parents have gotten divorced. You know, I just don't want any of that. You know?
I don't think anyone wants that.
Yeah, but I don't know. But it's like some people, because it's so prevalent. Like, some people, it's like normal. You know, like someone in your family said, like, "Oh, on your next husband, sweetie." Remember? Mm-hmm. Yeah, who was that?
I don't know.
That was someone in your family. Some people, it's normal.
So if you're not sure about the context, this is, I believe, her name's Kat Stickler. She's a TikTok comedian, and this was her husband at the time. They were talking about how both sets of their parents are divorced, and later they ended up divorcing themselves, unfortunately. I thought this video was really interesting because to me, as a person whose parents are together, it never occurred to me to think about how your parents' marital status could affect the way you yourself think about marriage. And it specifically got me wondering, well, okay, do adult children of parents who divorced wonder if they themselves are going to be divorced? And do they take divorce a little bit more lightly? Like, I believe his name's Matt Stickler was saying. So I looked at the research and basically what I found is yes, having divorced parents increases your likelihood of divorcing as well. In the research, it's called the intergenerational transmission of divorce, and it's a form of social inheritance, things that we inherit from our parents that are not genetic. In a study from 2008 that looked at 43,000 marriages, they analyzed 18 countries' data, and they found that women whose parents divorced have a significantly higher risk of divorce in 17 out of the 18 countries. I think that today's topic really drives home that we need to be proactive about not getting complacent in our relationships. And one way you can do that is by using the sponsor of today's video, the Paired app. The Paired app is a really fun way for couples to strengthen their relationship through things like daily questions, quizzes, games, exercises. If you find it difficult to communicate to your partner to their face, using this app can kind of take the pressure off so that you can still communicate what's important to you or maybe things that are a little harder to discuss, but in a way that still feels fun and flirty. It can also promote intimacy because it asks all these questions that I think couples don't always think to ask each other, and you can use it to discover either strength areas that you have as a couple or areas of growth. So here's how it works. You input special dates like anniversaries and birthdays to create the timeline of your relationship, and you can actually see how long you've been together to the day. You can also input other information like whether you live together, whether you're married, whether you have kids, and it personalizes the topics based on your answers to these questions. So you have things like Q&As about the first time meeting, relationship checkups, games to increase your physical intimacy. And it's really fun when you get the notification that your partner filled out a question, and it's actually really helped me gain insight into my relationship. You don't have to be in the same room to communicate using the app. It can become a little ritual of connection, to use a Gottman term. One of the core pieces of building a healthy relationship, according to the Gottman method, is to have these little traditions and rituals that you do on a frequent basis with each other to get closer and more intimate. What do you remember about the first time you met? Oh, the instant connection and powerful draw we had. That's sweet. Click my link below to get a free trial and 25% off of Paired Premium so that you can maintain and deepen your connection and intimacy with your partner. Thank you so much to Paired for sponsoring this video. One theory says that it's about the inheritance of certain personality traits or psychological aspects that predispose you to divorce. For instance, if your parent has a personality disorder that played a part in their divorce, maybe you also inherit the same personality structure and you're also more likely to divorce. Because maybe you have like a predisposition to certain interpersonal patterns that promote conflict. Another proposed theory is that children of divorce tend to marry earlier, and when you marry earlier, that in and of itself is a risk factor for divorce. Now, it's interesting. You would think like, okay, why do people marry earlier when their parents divorce? One possibility is that they're trying to get out of a stressful home environment, obviously. When your parents are divorced, you're kind of isolated with them one-on-one, and if they're not always safe people to be with, you might be itching for any excuse to leave the home. Another theory is that because of the trauma of divorce, offspring of divorced parents tend to have an earlier sexual initiation. Another possibility is that children of divorced parents are economically deprived because, divorces are expensive. You have to pay for lawyers and you have to pay alimony and move homes and all this stuff, and sometimes parents don't even want to pay for their kids after they're divorced, which is very unfortunate. Now, I had a slightly different theory that the research didn't talk about that was kind of inspired by this Kat Stickler video that I showed you. I wonder if adult children of divorced parents are trying to have a corrective experience with a person. They've seen divorce happen in their family and they say, I want to make sure that that doesn't happen to me. I wonder if on some level maybe they idealize the first relationship that they get into and they rush into something that might not actually be as constructive as they think it is. Let me know what you think about this. Now, there's another theory that adult children of divorced parents divorce more often because it's about absentee fathers. We know that absentee fathers are a risk factor for a bunch of different things. It's not good to have an absent father in your life. The evidence for this theory is weak because children of divorce still divorce more than those who have lost a parent. There's also a theory that children of divorce have inferior interpersonal skills. They didn't get to see their parents having healthy conflict or healthy communication, so they also don't know how to do that in their own relationships, and therefore they divorce at higher rates. Research is inconsistent on this one. Now, the theory with the most evidence supporting it is the theory that children of divorce have more positive attitudes towards divorce and more negative attitudes towards long-term relationships and marriage. They are less committed when they do marry. Studies show that children of divorce are actually more likely to consider divorce as an option when unhappiness arises in their relationship, especially if their parents divorced in a low-conflict marriage. What does this mean? If your parents seemed to be happy, didn't seem to have a lot of conflict, weren't screaming at each other every week, and they divorce, what do you think a child internalizes from that? Probably they internalize that it's okay to get divorced over maybe smaller things that weren't that distressing beforehand. Maybe marriage isn't that serious. Maybe it doesn't have to be a lifelong commitment. Versus having parents who have a very high conflict marriage, when they finally do divorce, it kind of makes sense. The kid thinks, well, they were deeply unhappy. It was very upsetting for all of us. There's a study from 2004 that was interesting. It said that maritally distressed parents who stayed together didn't predispose their kids to elevated risk for divorce. Meaning, if you had parents who were very high conflict and very distressed, and they stayed together, it doesn't mean you're more likely of divorcing. I would imagine that those kids are not as likely to see marriage as something not worth taking seriously, because they're probably not blaming the institution of marriage that their parents are unhappy. Let me know what you think about this, but from my perspective, when somebody's parents get divorced, often that person's reaction is, it must be something about the institution of marriage that's not right. Versus when somebody's parents are just fighting all the time and they stay together, I feel like people don't blame the institution of marriage as much. They say it's something about my parents' dynamic that's the issue. I almost feel like when something as traumatic as a divorce happens, it's easy to blame something external to the people involved. It's easier to say there's something wrong with marriage as a whole than there's something wrong with the people in this marriage. How do they communicate to each other? Do you agree? Let me know in the comments what you think. A study from 2008 also showed that children of divorce tend to have more negative attitudes towards marriage and are less optimistic about long-term relationships. And women's, but not men's, parental divorce was associated with lower relationship commitment and satisfaction. Researchers concluded that women of divorced parents are more likely to enter marriage with lower commitment and confidence, which leads to increased risk for divorce. Why women specifically? Why not women and men? Well, the researchers say that women are socialized to be more relationship-oriented, and so when relationship issues or divorce arise, they're more impacted by the lessons they learn. They tend to internalize that impermanence of marriage idea. Studies also show that girls suffer more negative consequences of divorce than boys, especially economically, which is pretty fucked up. So when considering all this research, I have to wonder, why don't we talk about this more? I think the reason we don't talk about this more, the reason why psychologists don't look into this quite as much, is because it hinges on something that people cannot control about themselves. Take Gottman's research, for instance. Gottman's research focuses on behavioral practices and how those are risk factors for divorcing. But your parents having divorced isn't something that you did. It's not anything that you have control over. And so it might feel a little bit defeatist for psychologists to focus on something knowing that it can't be changed. You can't change the fact that your parents divorced. There's nothing you can do to improve that. But don't worry, having divorced parents doesn't cause you to become divorced also. The research has found a lot of mediators: life decisions, education level, the age at which you get married, cohabitation, even fertility behavior, lower commitment to marriage, inferior interpersonal skills. In other words, it's not having divorced parents itself that predisposes you to divorce. It's the things that come as a result of having divorced parents that can sometimes create a cascade of events that then lead to your divorce. But there are a lot of factors at play, and a lot of them are your own life decisions and your own willpower. Also, here's another reassurance. In 1970, people with divorced parents were 2 times more likely to divorce, whereas more recent studies put the risk factor at only 1.2 times more likely to divorce. Basically, the intergenerational transmission of divorce is decreasing over time. Possible explanations include reduced stigma of divorce, leading to more social support if you divorce. The fact that divorce is more common now means that it's more normalized to leave a dysfunctional marriage and for people to not have those really unhealthy interpersonal conflict skills modeled to them. And here's another really important consideration. Do the parents repartner? Do the divorced parents then remarry or get into other relationships that are healthier and happier? Because I imagine if your parents divorced and they were never able to find a happy relationship, or they continued to get into unhealthy relationships, it's probably a lot easier for you to internalize that marriage is bad, divorce is inevitable, than if they repartnered with somebody who seems like the love of their life and they're so much happier now. If you experience the latter, it's much easier to frame it in your head as, well, my parents just weren't for each other. They weren't each other's people. Somebody else was a healthier option for them. It's not marriage that's the problem, it was the relationship that was the problem. Now, what can you do to offset this risk factor? Let's start off with, as an adult child of divorced parents, what can you do? One really simple thing is don't rush into marriage too quickly. Apparently, you're more likely to do that, and it is an additional risk factor. Do work on your relationship skills, things like communication, empathy, problem solving, conflict resolution, all of which are in the Connection course. So if you're looking for a specific place to do that, shameless plug, but the Connection course is literally created for this purpose. So a little bit of a tangent, but I just thought I'd put that out there. If you're an adult child of divorced parents, another thing you can do is take relationships and marriage seriously. Don't just run to divorce as the first option when things go sideways. And when you get into marriage, don't just adopt this attitude of, we'll see if it works out, or, oh, maybe my next husband will be better. I'm not a proponent of staying in relationships that are not working, that are unhealthy or abusive. But I'm also against the idea that we need to take marriage lightly and that lifelong commitment isn't a virtue. And another thing that you should be mindful of is that as a child of divorce, you might either rush into marriage or you might avoid it altogether. And neither one is particularly healthy. Obviously, if you don't want to get married, don't get married. But don't avoid marriage when you really care about someone just because you think it's going to go wrong. Don't idealize relationships and don't devalue them either. Don't think that a relationship is failed to doom just because somebody's not perfect. And don't think that a relationship is going to be the one corrective experience for your parents' divorce when somebody's clearly not for you. What about if you're a divorced or divorcing parent yourself? How can you help offset the risk factor to your children? The first one is exactly the same advice. Model healthy relationship skills. Whether you're divorcing, divorced, repartnered, or single, it doesn't matter. What is most important is, are you modeling healthy relationship skills? So the same skills that I talk about in the Connection course are also extremely important here. Something else that's important to do is to encourage commitment in relationships. Don't take divorce lightly. And if you do choose to divorce, don't give your child the impression that it was over something minor, that they can just divorce over something minor no matter what happens. I think it might be helpful to explain why things got to a point where you needed to divorce. No one divorces over something light, really. You might not be openly fighting, or your kids might not know about it, but most times people don't divorce lightly. It takes a lot for them to get to that point. Something else that's really important is to co-parent healthily. If you are divorced, it's still an opportunity to practice those healthy relationship skills with your ex. If there's a lot of friction, if there's still a lot of conflict, if it's really filled with animosity, that's going to probably make it harder on your kids to trust the institution of marriage. Also, provide economic, social, and emotional stability. Don't neglect your kids once you divorce. Don't cease to spend time with them. Be present. Don't be an absent parent. And be there for them. Support them emotionally. Also, emphasize good mate selection. Just because you ended up in a marriage with somebody who wasn't the right fit for you doesn't mean you can't still model healthy mate selection to your kids. You can still talk about what you learned from this experience, how they can figure out who's a good partner to marry when they're an adult. And more importantly, if you want to continue dating or if you want to remarry, show them that it's possible to find a better fit even after divorce so that they can understand, okay, it's not marriage that's doomed to fail. I just need to pick the right person if I want to get married. Are you a child of divorced parents? Because if so, I'm really curious how it's influenced your life. Obviously, it's not something that I've experienced, so I would love to hear your thoughts. I've also been considering on the research of how having divorced parents affects kids as a whole, so let me know if that's something you'd be interested in hearing. I hope you have a wonderful day and see you soon.